Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're not just doing a dry history lesson. We are unpacking the 1969 moon landing for what it truly was, a high-stakes, life-or-death technological thriller. Against absolutely staggering odds, humanity pushed the very limits of innovation and, well, bravery. To really grasp those stakes, I want you to imagine being strapped into a tiny metal box, hurtling toward the lunar surface, and suddenly realizing your computer is steering you directly into a massive crater filled with car-sized boulders. Touching down there meant an immediate, fatal crash. That was the terrifying reality for the crew of Apollo 11. But before we get into exactly how they survived that descent, let's rewind a bit to see how we even ended up in this perilous situation in the first place. Okay, let's dive into this. Back in the 1950s and 60s, the US and the Soviet Union were locked in the intense Cold War rivalry, right? And to prove who had the superior technology, they basically entered a space race. Now, the starting line, the Soviet Union was completely dominating. They launched Sputnik in 1957, put Yuri Gagarin in space in 1961. Meanwhile, the US, they had managed a meager 15 minutes of suborbital spaceflight. So the US was incredibly far behind, and national pride was very much on the line. In response to all that immense pressure, President John F. Kennedy stands before Congress and delivers this audacious, almost reckless dare to land a man on the moon before the decade is out. The sheer scale of this goal, it literally cannot be overstated. When JFK made that promise in May 1961, NASA completely lacked the rockets, the technology, and the computers needed to actually pull it off. They were, quite literally, promising the impossible. Section 1. Building from scratch, the arsenal. Because they promised the impossible, scientists and engineers had to invent the future right out of thin air. Back then, computers were the size of entire rooms, so NASA had to shrink all that down to fit inside a spacecraft, creating the Apollo guidance computer. Now, what's really interesting here is that it had just 4 kilobytes of RAM and 72 kilobytes of ROM. To put that into perspective for you, a single low-resolution photo on your smartphone right now uses way more memory than the computer that guided human beings all the way to the moon. It's wild. And because digital memory was just in its absolute infancy, they had to rely on something called LOL memory, which, no joke, stands for Little Old Lady's Memory. The software was literally woven by hand. Skilled textile workers, mostly women, threaded wires through tiny copper rings. They were physically sewing the ones and zeros together to create the binary code that would fly the ship. And then, of course, there was the physical brawn to match those digital brains. 363. That is the height in feet of Wernher von Braun's monster rocket, the Saturn V. Imagine a massive 30-story skyscraper, but one specifically designed to completely break free from Earth's gravity. To lift that 36-story behemoth, it required a staggering 7.5 million pounds of thrust. Those first-stage engines consumed roughly 4.5 million pounds of propellant in a matter of minutes. The sheer power generated noise and vibrations so strong they actually shook buildings miles away from the launch pad. It was the most powerful machine humanity had ever created. Section 2. The ultimate drama, the descent. So, after a 3-day journey across the void, we arrive at July 20, 1969. Michael Collins stays behind in orbit in the main ship, Columbia, while Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin climb into this tiny, fragile lunar module, nicknamed the Eagle, to head down. Just a few thousand feet above the lunar surface, the tension completely explodes. A loud alarm rings out in the cockpit, and the code 1202 flashes. The guidance computer is completely overloaded with radar data. It's threatening to crash, and if it fails, the lander loses control entirely. Enter the incredible brilliance of a 24-year-old guidance officer back on Earth named Jack Garman. He quickly realized that the computer wasn't actually failing, it was just smartly dropping non-essential tasks so it could prioritize flying the ship. He made an incredibly brave, mission-saving call, go, and so the descent continued. But the danger absolutely wasn't over. As Armstrong looked out his window, he realized the computer's autopilot was steering them directly into a massive crater, completely littered with boulders. If they touched down there, they were dead. Armstrong instantly switched off the autopilot and took manual control, flying the Eagle horizontally, hovering it almost like a helicopter to search for safe, smooth ground. Now, as he's flying manually, the fuel gauge is dropping dangerously low. Back in mission control, the timer is ticking down relentlessly. The radio crackles with a terrifying update. 60 seconds. They have exactly 1 minute of fuel remaining before they plummet like a stone. He's still searching for a spot. The fuel just keeps burning. The radio crackles again. 30 seconds. Millions of people around the world are watching their televisions in absolute, breathless silence. The climax of an entire decade of work is coming down to mere seconds. Finally, the lander kicks up lunar dust. Buzz Aldrin calls out, "Contact light, engine stop." And then Armstrong radios back to Earth. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." The tension in mission control just instantly broke into cheers, tears, and hugs. The massive relief? They had touched down with less than 25 seconds of fuel to spare. Unbelievable. Section 3. A giant leap. Let's see how this builds. Just a few hours later, Armstrong opens the hatch, climbs down the ladder, and places his left boot onto the gray, undisturbed dust of the moon, uttering that iconic phrase we all know. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Buzz Aldrin joins him shortly after, and they spend about 2.5 hours outside. They set up scientific experiments, collected 47 pounds of moon rocks, and proudly planted the American flag. And you know, this perfectly illustrates just how unique the lunar environment is. Because the moon has no atmosphere and absolutely no wind, those very footprints they left in the dust are still perfectly preserved to this very day.
Section 4. The Perilous Return. The Final Twist.
Getting to the moon and walking on it was this incredible triumph, but here's the twist. It was actually only half the battle. The most terrifying part of the whole mission was leaving. So the crucial point here is that the Eagle was equipped with only one single engine to blast them off the lunar surface to rendezvous with Michael Collins in orbit, and it was completely untestable in that environment. If that one engine failed to ignite, Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the moon forever with a slowly dying oxygen supply. The stakes were so incredibly high and the danger so real that back in Washington, the White House actually had a secret doomsday speech prepared for President Richard Nixon. It was drafted specifically to be read to the public in the catastrophic event that the astronauts were left behind to die. Fortunately, that terrifying speech was never needed. That single engine fired perfectly. Grounding this emotional thriller back into historical reality, we can look at the timeline. We had the launch on July 16th, the nail-biting landing on the 20th, and finally, after reuniting with Columbia, a completely safe splashdown in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th. Against all technological odds, and facing near disaster at almost every single turn, humanity achieved the impossible. We left our cradle and walked among the stars. Which leaves us with a final, provocative question. As we look back at the sheer audacity of Apollo 11, what is our next impossible dream? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep wondering and keep looking up.